Artillery has always been the backbone of modern warfare, but now Ukraine is about to flip the script. For years, Russia relied on sheer numbers, blasting away with endless artillery shells and outdated tactics. It outproduced NATO, pounding Ukraine's forces with brute force, hoping to overwhelm them. But brute force can't beat brilliance. Thanks to cutting-edge tech from Germany and Norway, Ukraine is fielding a game-changing weapon: ramjet artillery. These supersonic rounds don't just go farther, they go faster, strike harder, and leave Russia's old-school tactics in the dust. So what makes ramjet artillery so deadly? And could this be the weapon that breaks Russia's grip on the battlefield? Let's dive in. At its core, a ramjet artillery round has more in common with a jet engine than a traditional explosive artillery round. Like a jet engine, a ramjet round has an intake tube that has an opening at the front to take in the air as the round flies. The air then enters the mixing chamber, where it's ignited alongside small amounts of rocket fuel that the engine carries with it. The resulting combustion is directed to the exhaust chamber, which provides thrust. So unlike traditional artillery, which typically tops out with a range of 40 to 50 miles, modern ramjet designs could realistically have 2 to 5 times the reach of current missiles while retaining the same size, putting them on par with traditional short-range ballistic missiles like ATACMS. This means that an artillery battery could theoretically apply the same pressure at a fraction of the cost in terms of logistics and development. The ramjet is a relatively old concept that's seen a revival in recent years. Technology has advanced enough that it's possible to fit the necessary pieces inside the relatively small shell that is a 155mm artillery round. Germany and Norway in particular have two of the most promising prototypes currently in development, and they have started sending these prototypes for field testing in Ukraine. A traditional rocket like the ones being used to shuttle aircraft into space burns internal fuel storage to create thrust and reach operating speeds. This means that the rocket needs to carry significant amounts of fuel to reach meaningful speeds. A ramjet, on the other hand, needs relatively little actual fuel to maintain high speeds. Air has a natural quality called ram compression, which is when the air pressure significantly increases with velocity. This allows a jet engine to take in significant amounts of compressed air to further boost its speeds. Additionally, jet engines suffer from a distinct disadvantage compared to traditionally propelled missiles and rockets. They don't work at low speeds. Since the efficiency of a jet engine relies on air being compressed, a jet engine would need to burn through conventional fuel instead of air to reach the speeds necessary for ram compression to take effect. For the ramjet, these speeds can hit Mach 2.5 to 3, which is around 3 times the speed of sound. That means that traditional jet engines, like the one you see on aircraft, suffer significantly because they need to accelerate the entire structure to speeds where they actually become efficient. It's a bit of a catch-22 since jet engines work best at high speeds, but they first need to reach those speeds somehow. But that's why the concept works for artillery. Ramjet artillery pretty much avoids the acceleration problem entirely. Since the artillery battery, i.e. a cannon, is responsible for the initial delivery, a ramjet round is shot out at the speed necessary for the engine to start working near its full operating capacity. This, in theory, means that an artillery round can then use its internal fuel supplies alongside the air intake to maintain high speeds until it reaches its target. The technology that made ramjet engines possible has already been in use in conventional jet engines for decades. But it's only recently that the engines of this type could be made relatively small. This has meant that they still suffered from the inherent weakness of not being able to be accelerated toward their efficient operational parameters, i.e. Mach 3 speeds at which ram compression starts taking hold. That's why the experimental ramjet artillery shows so much promise. Downsizing the ramjet engine to be able to fit inside a traditional 155mm round casing could, in theory, transform how artillery works. And with downsizing, there's the inherent advantage of the increased range. Traditionally, if you wanted to increase the range of a projectile, there would only be a few possible avenues for you to take. For instance, you could increase the muzzle velocity or speed at which the projectile leaves the detonation chamber. For traditional artillery, there was only so much speed you could impart on the round, since the round itself didn't have any self-propelling capabilities. Over time, air drag and gravity would do their work, slowly decelerating the round until it reached the ground. To increase the muzzle velocity in traditional artillery, you need to use a more powerful propellant or a longer barrel. However, there's only so much propellant you can fit inside a detonation chamber before you start getting diminishing returns. More powerful propellants would create pressure that could damage the barrel of the artillery, severely reducing its expected lifespan. The second way is to increase the length and strength of the barrel. Increasing the length allows for the propellant to impart more of its impulse on the projectile due to the longer amount of time they stay in contact with each other. The third way to increase the range of the projectile is to modify the projectile itself. This is done by adjusting the aerodynamics and including sabots. piece that fits around a projectile to keep it aligned in the center of the barrel, to create a more streamlined profile that would reduce the amount of drag the projectile is subjected to during the flight. Alternatively, projectiles with lower mass have greater maximum speeds. However, this led to a series of trade-offs, as artillery rounds depended on its explosive warhead to inflict damage. Additionally, modern artillery rounds need tips made of heavy metals that can penetrate the armored hulls of vehicles and bunkers. Thus, increasing the projectile speed and subsequently distance would end up lowering the potential explosive yield of the artillery round, reducing its overall effectiveness. The ramjet artillery round solves this problem inherently. By using a jet engine, the ammunition suddenly has a self-propelling component. The US had already experimented with self-propelled artillery rounds even before the ramjet engines were developed. For instance, base bleed artillery would have a simple engine mounted at the back of the round that would burn internal propellant. However, the result of the improvement wasn't particularly worth the investment. The added self-propelling capacity didn't meaningfully increase the actual speed of the round, only reduced the inevitable deceleration caused by air drag. Furthermore, the addition of the propellant cannibalized the round's explosive yield, as it would have done with a lighter warhead. That's why a ramjet having a smarter jet engine is such a big deal. The engine's efficiency means that it needs significantly less fuel to achieve or maintain higher speeds. By abusing the inherent quality of the air to compress at high speeds, the jet engine essentially feeds into its own speed. Additionally, as the engine burns off its fuel, it becomes lighter, which allows it to counter some of the velocity loss accrued by air and gravity drag as it flies. The result is a theoretical range of ramjet artillery rounds of 100 miles in more recent experiments. Compare that to the traditional range of artillery rounds, such as the ones currently used in the war in Ukraine, which is typically between 20 and 40 miles at best. This means ramjet artillery has ranges that approach that of conventional missiles, including ATACMS missiles that NATO has donated to Ukraine over the past few years. But there's another important advantage of ramjets over traditional artillery: speed. When an artillery shell hits its target, it imparts kinetic energy into the impact, which is directly proportional to its speed. For armor-piercing rounds, the nose is made from high-density alloys, typically steel or tungsten, which directly penetrates the target through sheer kinetic impact. This allows the explosive warhead to be positioned closer to the intended target before it detonates, improving the chances of the explosive blast dealing sufficient damage to the target. This is yet another area where ramjet engines shine compared to the traditional dumb artillery. Typically, the muzzle velocity of a 155mm M777 howitzer is around 827 meters per second, which is approximately Mach 2.5. Once fired, a traditional artillery round starts losing that velocity relatively quickly. In contrast, a ramjet engine begins to kick in at that speed, with air compression and propellant combustion slowly starting to increase as the projectile flies. This allows the ramjet shell to reach its target at speeds far higher than its traditional counterparts, while maintaining the benefit of the increased range. But there's an even bigger reason why the increased range matters so much for modern warfare: safety. The war in Ukraine has cemented the fact that militaries have a far higher operational range than ever before. In particular, the advent of drone warfare and long-range surveillance means that armies can survey enemy positions dozens of miles beyond the front. This means that anything that even approaches the front could, at any point in time, be targeted by drones or even conventional missile and artillery strikes. The combination of artillery and drone warfare is why both sides have such a hard time making any progress throughout the war. The Ukrainian army has a much more developed drone warfare system, with effective kamikaze, first-person view, and anti-tank drones that can pair up to create a consistent and practically insurmountable offensive and defensive system that Russia needs to go through. The artillery then uses the information gathered by drone operators to launch more effective, low to mid-range strikes. For Russia, the concept is similar. Since Russia has much bigger numbers of artillery available, it can focus its efforts on quantity over quality, battering the Ukrainian forces with relentless artillery strikes to create consistent pressure. Furthermore, both sides of the conflict are developing and redeveloping new avenues of electronic warfare, mainly to counter the drones that the opposing side is fielding. That's partially why drones and artillery have remained one of the few consistent parts of engagement. Drones are a practical necessity for both sides due to their ability to perform both surveillance and offensive missions. On the other hand, artillery is one of the few longer-range systems that doesn't rely on electronics to hit the target. Missiles and other guided ordnance typically have some sort of electronics that can be tampered with externally to reduce their accuracy. Traditional artillery doesn't, bypassing the entire electronic warfare aspect. But as mentioned, traditional artillery has a significant range limitation, meaning the artillery batteries and howitzers need to be put perilously close to the front line. Even with a significant numerical advantage, Russian artillery can be taken out by either opposing artillery or longer-range strikes premeditated by drone surveillance. On the other hand, ramjet artillery can be deployed at a much greater distance from the front. The artillery is then protected by simply being out of range of conventional artillery and drone strikes, while still packing enough punch to be an effective offensive weapon. This means that Ukraine could, at least in theory, position its artillery batteries much closer to its defense systems. This would result in Russia needing to use its long-range capabilities, such as military drones and missile strikes, to mount meaningful pressure on Ukrainian artillery. That's something that Russia has been slowly losing throughout the war, as the main supplier of Russian drones, Iran, doesn't have nearly as much manufacturing capability to satisfy Russia's increasing demand. The addition of ramjet artillery, which started in May 2024 with early prototypes, would allow Ukraine to divest some of its forces from protecting artillery and moving them to the front line, thereby creating a more coherent defensive line. This would force Russia to use more of its short-range artillery on the front, which would in turn make them more vulnerable to Ukrainian drone strikes. Additionally, ramjet artillery being able to outrange traditional artillery allows them to win out in artillery against artillery tactics. The simple range advantage means that Ukraine would practically always get the chance to perform the first strike. But there's yet another aspect of ramjet artillery that might make it valuable for Ukraine: long-range diversity. Until relatively recently, Ukraine had a distinct range of disadvantages in the war. The Ukrainian military received a relatively limited supply of long-range missiles that could be used to strike deeper into Russian territory. Oftentimes, these missiles were used to demolish vital supply lines in the occupied part of Ukraine, stalling the Russian advance. However, that changed when Ukraine created a robust drone warfare industry. Beyond using smaller commercial drones for low-range operations close to the front line, Ukraine has also developed and tested various longer-range drone designs that could emulate the Iranian drones that Russia has been using since the very start of the invasion. The effect of these improvements has given Ukraine the ability to mount a large-scale drone attack all the way to Moscow, which is around 400 miles away from the Ukrainian border. The attack, which took place on September 10th, showcased that Ukraine did actually possess the ability to pressure Russian military complexes, industrial centers, and even population centers, all while remaining relatively safe from counterattack. The second advancement in long-range performance came much more recently when the administration of President Joe Biden allowed Ukraine to use the donated ATACMS missiles directly against Russia. The announcement, which came on November 18th, was succeeded by Ukraine launching 6 of those missiles into Russia's military stockpiles. But both systems have inherent downsides. The drone warfare system, as mentioned, relies heavily on electronic systems, meaning that Russia can, and likely has, developed a system to scramble the signals that drones need for guidance and targeting. Secondly, a military drone typically moves at speeds around 250 miles per hour, with faster varieties going around 500 miles per hour at most. These speeds are significantly below Mach 1, which is 741 miles per hour. This means that an anti-air defense system usually has no problems tracking and taking relatively slow drones out of the skies. This is a frequent occurrence on both sides of the war, as only a small percentage of long-range drone strikes actually manage to hit and damage their targets. The ATACMS system suffers from an entirely different issue: supply. While the ability to conduct long-range precision strikes into Russian territory is likely to be a great boon to the Ukrainian forces, allowing them to project more power from a greater distance, there's only a limited amount of these missiles available for use. According to the most recent reports, NATO had only donated about 50 ATACMS missiles. Of course, the US calls its deliveries significant, as each ATACMS missile is extremely costly and a great strategic resource by itself. However, NATO hasn't sent the most modern ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, or at least not entirely. The first significant batch of missiles was composed entirely of older models, which had an effective range of only 100 miles. In comparison, the newer missiles can reach up to 190 miles. Considering that longer-range ATACMS cost more than $1 million per unit, based on a contract from the manufacturer Lockheed Martin, the Kyiv Post posited that Ukraine received no more than a few dozen ATACMS in the most recent $300 million package, and even that number might be slightly elevated. With Ukraine using 1 or 2 ATACMS over several strikes throughout the war, the actual remaining supply is probably around a few dozen missiles. Out of those, it's uncertain how many of the long-range missiles Ukraine has, as 6 of them were likely used in the most recent strike into Russia. This paves the way for the ramjet prototypes to become the third option for long-range strike capacity. Furthermore, since the ramjet artillery shells that Norway and Germany are sending are in 155mm rounds, the actual artillery battery is the same as the one that launches traditional artillery shells, with only minimal modifications. While there's no precise information on how many ramjet artillery rounds have made it to Ukraine, the German company Rheinmetall has suggested that it'll likely start ramping up production soon. Before the war started, Rheinmetall was producing 70,000 artillery shells per year. By 2024, its production capacity increased to between 400 and 500,000 shells annually, with plans to ramp that up to 700,000 shells per year across its European plants by 2025. The company ultimately aims to achieve a median manufacturing capacity of 1.1 million rounds annually, which would nearly double NATO's artillery round production. The company released a statement in 2022 that said it would supply Ukraine with at least 100,000 artillery shells throughout 2024. At least 225 of those were confirmed to be Volcano high-precision rounds. Volcano are the precursors to the ramjet rounds, using the aforementioned internal self-propellant mechanism that resulted in a range of 45 to 50 miles. However, there is practically no information on exactly how many ramjet rounds the company has already provided to Ukraine, nor any meaningful reports of how many are being planned for production. Still, having more than 200 artillery shells with more range than its Russian counterparts would allow Ukraine to significantly diversify its long-range tactics. It showcases that NATO is confident that even these weapons should be enough for Ukraine to create meaningful progress and utilize them effectively on the front. This diversification comes at exactly the right time for Ukraine too. Russia has started amping up its efforts in both Donbass and Kursk. Over the past few months, Russia has managed to occupy another 500 square miles of territory in Donbass, creating ample forward momentum for its army through long-range drone and missile strikes deeper into Ukrainian territory. Similarly, Russia has managed to overtake around half of the territory that Ukraine occupied in Kursk. Even more importantly, Russia has started deploying North Korean soldiers who arrived in Kursk in mid-October. Ukrainian intelligence suggests that North Koreans are probably not going to make a significant difference in the grand scale of the conflict. This is because the North Koreans don't have the necessary training and equipment to compete with the modern drone-oriented tactics prevalent in Kursk. Ukraine posits that the casualty rate for the North Korean troops could be as high as 90%, meaning that of the 11,000 or so troops confirmed to be in Kursk, only slightly more than 1,000 are expected to survive the war. Still, those 11,000 soldiers are bodies that the Ukrainian military has to go through if it plans to successfully repel the Russian counteroffensive in Kursk, which was estimated to contain roughly 50,000 troops at one point. This will likely give the Russian military enough justification to divert even more troops to the front line in Donbass. Effectively, the North Koreans are a diversion from the real front line in Ukraine, yet the Ukrainian military can't afford to ignore it. But Ukraine is facing yet another, perhaps even more important problem: the change of US administration. With President Donald Trump now back in the White House, there's a possible shakeup in how the US administration, or particularly foreign policies, will shape the conflict. In his first term, Trump had a much more positive opinion both toward Russia and North Korea than the rest of the Western world, going so far as to become the first US president to visit North Korea. This could lead to Trump reversing some of the policies the Biden administration had enacted, especially the ones concerning sending weapons and financial aid to Ukraine. Additionally, Trump was previously a vocal opponent of the US remaining in NATO, particularly due to a majority of the members failing to meet the recommended national defense budgets for years. This issue has been solved on most counts, with Central European nations such as Germany and Poland injecting their militaries and NATO with billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, and both have significant military spending and weapon development capacity. However, there's no telling whether that will be enough for Trump and how he will guide US policy in the years to come. That's why Putin has been gearing up to make more offensive moves, going so far as to start a new round of nuclear saber-rattling, this time in response to the use of ATACMS missiles. For now, though, Trump's policies seem to not interfere with the order of things much, as the US aid to Ukraine hasn't ended. But Trump has noted that he has some plans on approaching a peace deal, and unlike previously, he seems to be more vocally opposed to Putin. He's noted that the war should have never happened, and that he could have ended it in a few days back in 2022 if he were in office. However, there's no telling whether Trump's plans will go in Ukraine's favor. The added long-range capacity that Ukraine has been developing, and which has been donated by Norway and Germany, can provide them some short-term relief. It would allow Ukraine to prove that it can still put up meaningful opposition to Russia's offensive, which could win it some negotiation points with Trump. But regardless of how exactly the war in Ukraine progresses, there are few signs it will end in 2025. The addition of new artillery capabilities can create meaningful changes in military strategies around the world. The new ramjet artillery, if adopted, can make entire systems obsolete, and once again showcase just how far NATO is ahead of its geopolitical opponents. But what do you think? Will the ramjet make an impact on the war in Ukraine? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you as always for watching. Now go and check out this German weapon brings the Russian Air Force to its knees, or click this other video instead.